È bello avere quello che ti serve quando ti serve. Con EasyBank, la banca digitale di Intesa Sanpaolo. EasyBank, semplicemente banca.
Vi prego, vi imploro, con umiltà e con fiducia, permettete a Cristo di parlare all'uomo.
Don Gius aveva capito il problema che avevo. Se la tua vocazione è vero, il tuo lavoro verrà fuori anche dai sassi.
Di comunicare la fede agli altri, ma veramente insieme a loro riscoprire che cos'è la fede, che cos'è la fede per me. Portare Cristo agli altri, comunicarlo agli altri è l'unico modo che abbiamo per conoscerlo veramente.
L'iter communionis aiuta a comunicare all'esterno la ricchezza di vita, di giudizi, di tentativi, di opere che nascono dalle persone e dalle comunità. L'iter communionis è proprio la vita del movimento. Scrivete all'iter communionis le vostre esperienze, ci fate bene.
È bello avere quello che ti serve quando ti serve. Con EasyBank, la banca digitale di Intesa Sanpaolo. EasyBank, semplicemente banca.
prego, vi imploro, con umiltà e con fiducia, permettete a Cristo di parlare all'uomo.
Don Gius aveva capito il problema che avevo. Se la tua vocazione è vero, il tuo lavoro verrà fuori anche dai sassi.
Di comunicare la fede agli altri, ma veramente insieme a loro riscoprire che cos'è la fede, che cos'è la fede per me. Portare Cristo agli altri, comunicarlo agli altri è l'unico modo che abbiamo per conoscerlo veramente.
L'iter communionis aiuta a comunicare all'esterno la ricchezza di vita, di giudizi, di tentativi, di opere che nascono dalle persone e dalle comunità. L'iter communionis è proprio la vita del movimento. Scrivete all'iter communionis le vostre esperienze, ci fate bene.
Questo è un luogo che genera dialogo,
Qualcuno che si impegna, che si batte.
che approfondisce la conoscenza e sostiene la fiducia. È un crocevia dove si incontra chi desidera il vero, il bello, il giusto e il bene. È una testimonianza di speranza nel cuore ferito del presente. E tutto questo esiste anche grazie a te.
Un cordiale benvenuto a tutti.
Welcome to all of you. In particular, welcome to President Mario Draghi. Dear President, thank you very, very much for being here with us during the very first day of this year's edition of the meeting. We are very grateful to you for accepting our invitation to share with us your views on the future of Europe. You were at the meeting in 2009, in 2020, and in 2022. 3 visits at pivotal moments for Italy and Europe. One was during the pandemic. And your visit today comes at a time that is strategic because the countries of the EU need to make a change in order not to lag behind. When you were director of the European Central Bank, you strongly committed to rearrange the economic and financial settings of the EU. And in difficult times, you made far-sighted decisions. And also as Prime Minister, you never had any doubts about the need to reinforce the cooperation and collaboration inside the Union and to support it in order to make the EU a strong player on the international scenario. Your multiple experiences gained over those years, thanks to your studies and exchanges with key scientific and economic players, had a key role in European competitiveness that has become one of the key players. And I mean, what you did has remained as historic. The EU is the only and largest space in the world where the rule of law, human rights, and democracy, and social economy and universal welfare coexist. These achievements have been gained over centuries through difficult and sometimes controversial processes. But this very same story shows us that these assets are not there forever. We cannot take them for granted because those assets and values need to be nurtured and nourished. They depend on the strong rooting in a responsible and empowered civil society. They need to be constantly, repeatedly renewed. I'm sure that the cultural roots of our continent can still today provide new blood and new teachings for our future. We need to feed a new dialogue, a new debate, because we need to go back to our key values, the welcome of the other and go back to the ancient principles of the Greek and Roman cultures, but also the Judeo-Christian tradition. It goes without saying that those are the values we need to go back to, especially when faced with the enormous challenges of today. And let's consider the recent traditions of liberalism and socialism. Considering that Europe has such a rich tradition of customs practices, but also of social and anthropological thinking that should not be flattened out and simplified, but instead enhanced in their richness in an open, sincere, and mutual dialogue. And certainly, these meetings edition wants to reaffirm the preciousness of the freedom that we have, and such freedom becomes resourceful when we try to create new bricks to build a new future. So going back to common good, personal commitment, social commitment in intermediary bodies, and in political involvement. We need to re-empower ourselves to build a new Europe. We are all accountable. We are all responsible, dear President. That is why we are eager to listen to you and then to listen to your answers to our questions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for this round of applause. President Scholz, thanks for your dear words. I want to thank Director Folani and all the authorities. For years, the European Union believed that the economic dimension with 450 million consumers could bring with it geopolitical power and power in international trade relations. This year, we will remember this year as the year in which this illusion has vanished. We had to resign ourselves to the tariffs imposed by our biggest and longest partner, the US. And by the very same partner, we were pushed to increase military expenditures, something that probably we should have done all the same, but maybe in the forms and shapes and ways that do not reflect the interest of Europe. The EU, in spite of having supported financially with the greatest contribution of all the war in Ukraine, has played so far a marginal role in the negotiations for peace so far. In the meantime, China openly supported the war effort of Russia while it was expanding its industrial capacity to export its overproduction in Europe, especially now that the access to the American market is limited by the new barriers imposed by the US government. While European protests were not very effective, China clarified that does not consider Europe as a peer, as an equal foot partner, and uses its control in the domain of rare earth to somehow make us more and more dependent. And Europe was an observer when the Iranian nuclear sites were bombarded and Gaza massacre was intensified. these events somehow brought an end to the illusion that the economic dimension alone could guarantee some form of geopolitical power. So it is not surprising that the skeptical attitude towards Europe has reached new peaks. But it is important to ask ourselves what is the real object of this skeptical attitude. Is not a skeptical attitude towards the value on which the EU relies on: democracy, peace, freedom, independence, sovereignty, prosperity, equality. As President Scholz said, we have a social welfare that is unique, probably the most developed one in the world. Even though that support that Ukraine should surrender to Russia's request will never ever accept the very same destiny for their countries. They also consider freedom, independence, and peace as fundamental, even just for themselves. I think that instead the skeptical attitude has to do with the ability of the EU to protect and defend these values. This is partially understandable. The political organizational models, especially those that are over the state, are there also to fix problems that are related to their times. When the times change so much that such a pre-existing organization becomes vulnerable, then those organizational models have to change. The EU was established because in the first half of the 20th century, the previous political organizational models, the nation states, had completely failed when it came to defending the founding values. Many democracies had denied and rejected every rule in favor of force and violence, and the consequence that Europe was devastated and torn apart by the Second World War. So the Europeans of that time naturally developed a form of collective defense for democracy and peace. The EU so became the national evolution responding to the most urgent problem of the time. So the tendency of Europe to slip into conflictual situations. And we cannot argue that we would be better without the EU. Thank you. The Union then evolved over the years again and adapted itself gradually to the neoliberal phase between 1980 and the first years of 2000. That period was characterized by the faith in free exchange and in the opening up of markets, by sharing multilateral rules, and by being aware of a reduction of the power of states, delegating tasks and autonomy to independent agencies. Europe saw new prosperity in the world, transformed its market, creating the single market, and became a key player in the World Trade Organization, and also created independent authorities for competition and the monetary policies. But that world is over, and many of those features have disappeared. But in the past, rightly or not, the markets dictated the rules. But today you have long-term industrial policies. In the past, there was the respect of rules. Today, there is the use of military force and economic power to protect national interests. In the past, the state saw a reduction in its powers, but today, instead, all the tools are used in order to make a state rule. Europe is not very well equipped in a world where geoeconomics, security, and stability of the supply sources, much more than efficiency, seem to inspire and determine international trade relations. our political organization need to adapt to the needs of its times, especially when they are strictly related to survival. So us Europeans, we need to reach a consensus about the consequences of this new situation. It goes without saying that destroying European integration, going back to national sovereignties, would do nothing but make us even more vulnerable and exposed to the willingness of the big powers. But it is also true that in order to protect Europe from a growing skeptical attitude, we do not simply need to save what has been done at best in the past and trying simply to survive. The achievements that we gained and obtained were adapted to the challenges of that time and tell us not very much about our ability to tackle and face the new challenges we're confronted with. So realizing that economic force is a necessary condition, but it is not the only one enough to have geopolitical force, may lead to a real and useful political reflection on the future of the Union. Maybe we can be comforted by the fact that the EU has been able to evolve over the past, but adapting to the neoliberal order was relatively easy in the past. The main goal at that time was to open up the markets and to limit the intervention of the states. The EU then could act mainly as a regulator and trying to avoid the most difficult question of political integration. So in order to face today's challenges, the EU needs to shift and turn from an extra or a supporting role to the key player. So it also needs to change its political organization that goes hand in hand with its ability to reach its economic and strategic goals. The economic reforms remain crucial in order to become fully aware of this need of change.
Almost 80 years after the Second World War, the collective defense of democracy is taken for granted, as recalled by President Scholz. And is taken for granted by generations who do not remember those times. They strongly believe in the European political construction, and that also depends significantly on its ability to provide citizens with prospects for the future, and therefore on economic growth, which in Europe over the past 30 years has been lower than in the rest of the world. The report on European competitiveness has shown the many areas where Europe is losing ground and where reforms are very urgent. But there is a topic which is very common throughout the report, the need to fully exploit the European dimension on two axes. The first one is the internal market. The Single Market Act was approved almost 40 years ago. Still, there are significant hurdles to the internal trade in Europe. The removal of these hurdles would have a substantial impact on the growth of Europe. The International Monetary Fund says that if our internal barriers were reduced, just like in the United States, labor productivity in the EU could be much higher, about 7% higher after 7 years. I think about that it was like maximum 2% in the past few years. The cost of these barriers is already visible. The European states are embarking on a huge military operation with 2 trillion euros, 1/4 in Germany, of additional expenditure in defense, planned between today and 2031. But we have internal barriers that impose a 64% tariff on equipment and 95% on metals. These leads to slower tenders, higher costs, greater supplies from suppliers outside the European Union. And all of that because of the obstacles or hurdles that we are imposing ourselves. Then the second axis, where the EU is essential, is technology. It is now clear from how the global economy is evolving that no country wishing to have prosperity and sovereignty can be excluded from critical technologies. The United States and China are openly using their control on strategic resources, on technologies, to obtain concessions in other areas, in many other areas. Too much dependence has become incompatible, inconsistent with the sovereignty on our future, with the ability and the willingness we have to design our own future. No European country on its own can have the necessary resources to build the industrial capacity needed to develop these technologies. The industry of semiconductors shows this challenge. Chips are essential for digital transformation occurring today, but facilities to produce chips require major investments. In the United States, public and private investment is concentrated on a small number of major companies with projects ranging from $30 to $65 billion, whereas in Europe, most expenditure takes place at a national level, basically through state aid. Projects are much smaller. They range from $2 to $3 billion, and they are scattered among our countries, which have different priorities. The European Court of Auditors has already warned that it is very unlikely that the EU achieves its objective to increase by 2030 its global market share in this sector to 20%. Today, we are at less than 10%. And in 5 years, we should double our global market share of chips and semiconductors worldwide. So, both in terms of the internal market and in terms of technologies, we go back to one essential point. In order to achieve these objectives, the EU has to move towards new forms of integration. And we have the opportunity to do so. For example, with the 28th regime, this is one of the proposals made by the European Commission that it should table by the end of this year. Basically, we should have the same legal regime throughout the European Union, only for small companies. This way, small companies could operate in the 27 EU member states without needing to create branches in each single country, which is always too expensive for small companies. For example, we can do that with an agreement on European projects and to allocate funds to them together. And this is a prerequisite for these projects to become technologically meaningful and to become self-sufficient. In other words, projects can be repaid only if they're big enough. Otherwise, they cannot be repaid. In order to be big enough, we need to think about new forms of common financing, not just national financing. Years ago, at your meeting, I recalled that there is good debt and bad debt. The bad debt finances consumption or waste, leaving its burden to future generations. The good debt serves to finance investments in strategic priorities and in increasing productivity. It generates a growth which will repay this debt. However, in some sectors today, the good debt is no longer possible at national level because investments made on their own, in isolation, cannot achieve the critical mass to justify the debt needed to finance them and to increase productivity. Only forms of common debt can support European far-reaching projects that fragmented and non-sufficient national efforts would never be able to implement. This is the case for defense, and especially for research and development in defense, which I think is the most interesting dimension. And this is a decision posing problems to many people in the European Union. So this decision should be made reasonable as much as possible. This is also the case for energy, for the necessary investments in networks and in the European infrastructure, for disruptive technologies, an area where risks are very high, but the potential success is fundamental to transform our economies. Skepticism helps seeing through the fog of rhetoric, but we also need to have hope for change and trust in our own skills to implement change. You have all grown up in a Europe where nation-states, I believe all of you, have grown in a Europe where nation-states have lost their importance. You have grown as Europeans in a world where it is quite natural to travel, to work, and to study in other countries. Many of you accept to be both Italians and Europeans. Many of you recognize that Europe can help small countries to achieve together objectives that otherwise they would never been able to achieve, especially in a world dominated by superpowers such as the United States and China. And therefore, it is natural for you to hope in a change in Europe. We have also seen that over the years, the EU has been able to adapt in emergency, sometimes going beyond any reasonable expectation. We've been able to break historical taboos, such as the common debt with the Next Generation EU program, and to help one another during the pandemic. Very fast, we have implemented a wide vaccination campaign. We have shown that we were united in responding to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But these were reactions, responses to emergencies. Now the challenge is to be able to act with the same decision at ordinary times to tackle the new challenges in this new world. The world doesn't look kindly upon us. This world doesn't expect the length of our bureaucracy and our community practices to impose its strength. This world wants from us a discontinuity in objectives, in timings, and in working methods. The presence of the 5 leaders of European states and of the presidents of the Commission and the European Council at the last meeting at the White House was a demonstration of unity, which is much more important to European citizens than many meetings in Brussels. So far, a lot of the adaptation effort was made by the private sector, which has proved to be sound despite the instability of new trade. European companies are adopting last-generation digital technologies, including artificial intelligence, just like the United States is doing. And a strong European manufacturing base will be able to meet the new demand for a greater internal production. What is still behind, what is lagging behind, is the public sector, where decisive changes are needed. Governments have to decide on which sector they want to pursue their industrial policy. They have to remove the unnecessary barriers and review the authorizations in the field of energy. And they have to agree on how to fund the significant investments that are necessary in future, which account for about 1 or 2 trillion euros a year. And they have to design a new commercial policy in line with a world that is abandoning multilateral rules. In short, they have to find once again unity of action. And they will not have to do so when it's going to be unsustainable. But right now, when we still can, where we can still design our own future, we can change the course of our continent. Turn your skepticism into action. Make your voice heard. The European Union is first and foremost the mechanism to achieve the common objectives of its citizens. It is our best opportunity for a future of peace, security, and independence, and solidarity. It is a democracy, and it's us, you, it's the citizens, the Europeans, that have to decide their priorities, its priorities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for your reflections that are far-sighted and are really strong and powerful, and an open, somehow, dialogue and conversation seems to be taken for granted from that. But actually, everything you said would require such an open dialogue among EU governments that instead of getting closer to each other, get more and more distant from each other. So if we consider the EU project in relation to the world competitiveness, seems to be not enough to integrate the governments. Skepticism instead seems to prevail, especially in some countries. So how could it be possible to overcome this fragmentation that is underway even in individual EU countries, even among political parties? How could the cultural repositioning of Europe could be helpful in this respect? Well, the cultural repositioning is very important. You said it, I also said it, because when it comes to values, especially for those generations that never experienced war, have no single memory or souvenir of that. So freedom, solidarity, independence, and democracy are such precious values, and they cannot be taken for granted any longer. We are used to take them for granted, but the world is saying one very clear thing to us. Maybe 5 or 6 years ago, well, things were different. Yes, maybe some people were clairvoyant about that, but now the message is very clear. The message from the rest of the world is extremely clear. It has changed, and now the world does not guarantee the social, cultural, economic setting we were used to. And certainly, many Europeans somehow talked and raised their voices. And specifically, many people working in several economic sectors raised their voice. So there was a raising awareness. And there was a report that was a three-legged report, because on the one hand, the EU put at disposal all the knowledge gathered by the European Commission services. And so it was possible to somehow make stock of what had been done. And then there was the industry and the social partners. I interviewed dozens of CEOs and managing directors of companies in Europe and also that moved abroad. And I asked them, why did you move? And they told us what should be done. And then There was the cooperation of dozens of people, Nobel Prize winners, and scientists, engineers, physicists, economists, many people that joined the writing of this report. So all together, we were able to write this report, to compose its narrative. And that marked a very, very important self-awareness moment. I remember in September 2023, I was already talking about such topics, but nobody was aware of things not going well at all. Everybody was pretty calm. So industry-wise, politics-wise, and also in Brussels. Secondly, we had a pretty brutal and rude wake-up call from President Trump, while the U.S. elections were a game changer. And, well, if we think about what's happening today, don't you think that maybe the very first thing to do would be to get closer to each other? Well, that should be the second, well, that's the second key pillar of this report. And I think that is why now we are experiencing a political, social, and cultural atmosphere that may lead to a meaningful change. I'm not saying that nothing of what is being suggested in the report can be done in the short run. Well, timing is key, but first of all, people need to get along with each other. Always remember the beginning of the negotiations about the Maastricht Treaty. It was 1991, and I remember a conversation with Ciampi, that at the time was the president of the Bank of Italy. I remember meetings going on for hours until the middle of the night. And he told me, well, I'm being told that I should not join the construction of the euro because we are losing ground in terms of monetary sovereignty. But I have no monetary sovereignty today. So I have to do what the German central bank says, the Bundesbank. Either I do what the Germans say, or the lira, the Italian currency, will collapse. And the lira, the Italian currency, had collapsed many times over the years. So when you negotiate something, you lose something, but you also gain a lot on other sides. And Ciampi said, I prefer to have a little slice of a large sovereignty than nothing at all, as today. The stiffness, the rigidity, being passive are things that lead to the lack of action. And this is what I've been seeing over the last 10, 15 years. Procrastination, postponing important decisions because people were not able to get on well. And the lack of action is the worst enemy of Europe. So we said that democracy, objectively, it's a value that characterizes Europe in a clear way with respect to other entities and realities in the world. But democracy in Europe grew because there were schools of democracy, like associations, social entities, and the parties very well rooted in the local communities. So there was a very active civil society that was able to express itself. People learn to commit, to engage, to accept compromise, to negotiate. All that kind of things has disappeared. We see more and more sympathy towards autocratic systems that somehow increase constantly their power. In your opinion, should we go back to grassroots democracy, because the civil society is more and more polarized and fragmented. Well, it's two different levels. On the one hand, governments need to agree about what to do altogether. On the other hand, the civil society and the danger that you described is real, is true. Our society is being more and more atomized and fragmented. And an atomized society is a society where loneliness prevails, where citizens are very distant from institutions. They do not feel the presence of institutions. They do not feel the presence of the state, and let alone of the EU. So the intermediary bodies are very important because it's part of their very own vocation to make institutions and their decisions closer to the people. Thanks to this, well, it is possible to have the proximity, and probably the younger generations feel both their states and the EU as very distant. The farthest the institutions, the more needed is the work of intermediary bodies. So we should somehow embrace that path again with enthusiasm and joy. Well, you grew in countries where nation states lost a bit of ground. And certainly in that kind of scenario, it's hard to find reference points. So even religious intermediary bodies that by definition are transnational ones are extraordinary tools. And by the way, I said at the end of my speech, you need to be your voice be heard, because these are indispensable channels to somehow convey and make the citizens' voice be heard. So this is important to enhance the values of such intermediary bodies when it comes to enhancing the role of EU vis-à-vis European citizens. I'd like to ask with a more personal question. So during your whole political career and your professional career, you always expressed a deep appreciation for Europe and the EU. Well, I mean, always expressing criticism if needed, but always stating out loud that this is the only way. And in particular, this was very clear in July 2012 when you said the famous "whatever it takes." That marked somehow the pathway that led to the EU financial economic repositioning at a global level, because you were able to regain the confidence of the markets. I mean, my question is the following. How did you develop this very strong European sentiment and feeling? How were you able to be so daring in some choices that you made over your career? Well, my cultural background was not particularly European-centered. And my university diploma was about the fact that the single currency Europe was absolutely useless. And in the following years in the US, I remember looking at Europe as, I don't know, a strange bureaucratic entity that, at least to me, was not appealing at all, and to me, its direction was not clear at all. Then, when I came back to Italy at the beginning of the 90s, I first saw that something occurred during the 80s. So the single act law, the single act treaty was signed. And on top of that, things in EU countries had changed since the time I wrote my final dissertation. Well, the countries got closer to each other. So giving a chance to the euro was a possibility. It was possible to give it a shot. And then I got closer to the Maastricht Treaty negotiations. It was the very simple thing, the very first thing, I was assigned to, the first task I was assigned to. So, well, I joined these negotiations without somehow being biased by the European values rhetoric. So I was pretty objective about it. I simply saw it as a matter that could be successful or not. And at the end of the day, well, the outcome was good, but it took effort, it took work. And when I became president of the European Central Bank, and as you know, the role of the European Central Bank is to guarantee stability of prices. That's its only role, but the euro risks to disappear. And I ask myself, what's the point of keeping prices stable if there won't be any currency measuring those prices, expressing those prices? And so I thought, well, so far, this currency, proved to be strong enough to survive. And maybe this currency is at the center of a broader political construction process that could be the future of all of us. But, well, at that time, I was not fully aware of that. I simply saw that there was a situation that could be fixed and could be tackled, and it was my duty to tackle it. That's the story of my European conviction and my European persuasion. Then that developed into something more political, but I'm not a European supporter of the first hour, basing myself of the big fathers, of the great founding fathers. I always remember what Helmut Schmidt, German chancellor in the past, said when he was asked, don't you have a European vision? Well, and they usually said, well, if you want a vision, just go to a good eye doctor. Well, I'm very pragmatical, as this gentleman was. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to you all. And thanks again for sharing this very pragmatic approach, very grounded, but maybe this is the right approach to make the right steps in the right direction. Thank you all.
Questo è un luogo che genera dialogo,
qualcuno che si impegna, che si batte,
che approfondisce la conoscenza e sostiene la fiducia. È un crocevia dove si incontra chi desidera il vero, il bello, il giusto e il bene. È una testimonianza di speranza nel cuore ferito del presente. E tutto questo
proporre con la propria vita
esiste anche grazie a te.
È bello avere quello che ti serve quando ti serve. Con Easy Bank, la banca digitale di Intesa Sanpaolo. Easy Bank, semplicemente banca.
Vi prego, vi imploro, con umiltà e con fiducia, permettete a Cristo di parlare all'uomo.
Don Gius aveva capito il problema che avevo. Se la tua vocazione è vero, il tuo lavoro verrà fuori anche dai sassi.
Di comunicare la fede agli altri, ma veramente insieme a loro riscoprire che cos'è la fede, che cos'è la fede per me. Portare Cristo agli altri, comunicarlo agli altri è l'unico modo che abbiamo per conoscerlo veramente.
L'iter communionis aiuta a comunicare all'esterno la ricchezza di vita, di giudizi, di tentativi, di opere che nascono dalle persone e dalle comunità. L'iter communionis è proprio la vita del movimento. Scrivete all'iter communionis le vostre esperienze, ci fate bene.
È bello avere quello che ti serve quando ti serve. Con Easy Bank, la banca digitale di Intesa San Paolo. Easy Bank, semplicemente banca.
Vi prego, vi imploro, con umiltà e con fiducia, permettete a Cristo di parlare all'uomo.
Don Gius aveva capito il problema che avevo. Se la tua vocazione è vero, il tuo lavoro verrà fuori anche dai sassi.
Di comunicare la fede agli altri, ma veramente insieme a loro riscoprire che cos'è la fede, che cos'è la fede per me. Portare Cristo agli altri, comunicarlo agli altri è l'unico modo che abbiamo per conoscerlo veramente.
L'iter communionis aiuta a comunicare all'esterno la ricchezza di vita, di giudizi, di tentativi, di opere che nascono dalle persone e dalle comunità. L'iter communionis è proprio la vita del movimento. Scrivete all'iter communionis le vostre esperienze, ci fate bene.